So today we want to continue in our study with Ruth, the second act or the second chapter. And if you remember, the story of Ruth takes place in a most disturbing time in Israel's history. It was the time of the judges. It was a time when, in the last verse of the book of Judges, it says that there was no king in Israel, and everyone did as he saw fit. In other words, God was supposed to be the king of Israel. He says, I'm your king. You don't need a king. They said, no, we want a king. And in the meantime, until you give us a king, we're just going to do what we see fit in our own eyes. It sounds like a commentary on the world today. But that was the age of the judges. Nobody was looking to God. They were looking to their own wisdom to guide their lives. And they made a mess of things time and time again. God would rescue them, and then they would blow it in all of their rebellion, in all of their sinfulness, in all of their depravity. It was a cycle over and over again, which God would rescue them, and they would soon forget about all that God had done, and they would go back to just doing things that seemed right to them, things that benefited them. But in the end, it left them destitute. And the whole culture was so disturbed. If you ever get a chance, read the book of Judges and see how far the people sink. The more God seemed to show that he was faithful, the more unfaithful they became. And the more hope, if they had any at the beginning, the more hope that they tried to achieve through their own efforts, the more they lost, until it just fell apart on them. Tucked right in the middle of this disturbing time in the history of Israel is this story of the book of Ruth. Charles Dickens' 1859 novel, A Tale of Two Cities, began with this famous statement, and you'll know it. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. And most people stop there, but Dickens goes on and he says, it was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the age or the epic of belief. It was the epic of incredulity. In other words, it was the epic of the inability or the unwillingness to believe. It was a season of light. It was a season of darkness. It was a spring of hope. It was a winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct to the other place. This seems to be a description of the days of the judges. It was a time of spiritual schizophrenia on an epic scale. These scenes, as I've said, play out over and over again in the book of Judges, and the story of Ruth takes place in this era. It was in the days of the judges, and it shows us that even in the worst of times, God is planning for the best of times. That God, even when things are dark, he knows your plight, and he cares. That things aren't happening by accident, but rather that God is working behind the scenes, and he's working all of these things together. All of these happenings in our lives. And he's working through and with sinful acts of depraved people as well as kind and generous acts of good people to bring about his purpose in our life that would provide for us the good that he desires. God hasn't left us here alone to our own device. He loves us too much. And so even in all of our depravity, even in all of our own human wisdom and all of the mess that we create and all of that, the book of Ruth says that God is working behind the scenes, and if we'll just open our eyes, we'll see that if we'll become faithful to him, if we'll demonstrate a faith in him that goes beyond the average faith, that only calls on God when we need Him, that He will indeed work things out for our benefit because He cares. Now, the story of Ruth, though, even though it offers hope to people, has a speed bump, and that speed bump is called Act 1, or Chapter 1. It began with a fateful trip. We talked about it last week, where a man, a father, Elimelech, because of a famine in Bethlehem, the house of bread, how ironic, he takes his family to Moab, a place where he should have never taken them. He takes his wife, Naomi, who is a wonderful, vibrant lady, and his two sons, if you remember, swine flu and Ebola, and they go to Moab to live. And there, Elimelech, whose name means my God is king, dies. And his two sons marry Moabite women, and then his two sons die. And what we're left with are three widows, and they have virtually no hope to survive in the Moabite culture. They're destitute. And then word comes that God is coming to the aid again by providing bread, by providing food in Bethlehem. And so the three widows set off for Bethlehem. One turns back, but one goes with her mother-in-law, Naomi. It's a story of two widows who have nothing but hope. Hope that maybe they can get back to Bethlehem and that God can provide for them. And in God's sovereign plan, He brings them back just at the time that the barley harvest was beginning. And that's no coincidence at all. It is God working behind the scenes to get them where He needs them to be so that He can bless them even in their destitute state. And because He's bringing them back at this time, it speaks volumes, especially to Naomi, this Israelite woman from the tribe of Judah. It is a big deal because winter is over by this time and spring has begun. And now the festival, the harvest of first fruits begins. That's the barley harvest. Jews to this day celebrate this particular harvest festival. It's called the Feast of First Fruits because they take in their hands the first grains of the barley harvest, and they recognize that even though we planted and we worked the fields, it was really God that gave us the increase. And they present those grains to the Lord. And the great thing about this whole idea of first fruits is that it anticipates more harvest to come. New life is awaiting these destitute widows who have virtually in that culture no hope of making it. They are going to die miserable, poor deaths. But God in His providence leads them back at just, ironically, at just the right time. And He does it at a time of year when everybody would be celebrating the fact that new life awaits for a whole new season. Winter's over. Spring is here. And so what it does is it offers them an encouragement when they are at their lowest, that God is working behind the scenes to redeem them, to buy them back, to give them their life back. And that's what He does for us. When we read the story of Ruth, though, what we see is ordinary people going about their business, having ordinary discussions, facing ordinary problems, like, we don't have any food. We're going to have to go to work. What are we going to do? Or we're going to have to beg for our food. Even a romance in Act 2 emerges. All of God's providence is somehow working behind the scenes in the lives of ordinary people. I mean, it's the farthest thing from their minds. They're simply trying to make ends meet. And they're sort of unaware of what God is doing behind the scenes. All of these things, discussions, hard work, a little romance, they seem the furthest thing from God's cosmic plan to provide for His people. But behind all of that, what we see is that God is at work on their behalf. I love how one of the authors that I was reading sets up this act. He says this: it is tempting to cast this chapter or this act in a romantic mode. although that was not foremost in the minds of the key characters. But as with many good romances, the readers know more than the players. So as we're reading this, we see that the players are basically unaware. The characters are unaware. But we begin to read the hints, and we begin to read into the story that has been prepared for us. The shy interest Boaz, which we'll meet Boaz in this act, the shy interest Boaz displayed, coupled with his kindness, his hesed, which is a very important word to Jewish people, placed alongside his charming hesitation because he regarded himself as an unworthy suitor, invite us to root for him in a pursuit that he has not yet acknowledged. Ruth is unaware of the significance of his interest. Her unassuming innocence, attributing his interest to nothing more than God's blessing, which it is, likewise invites us to regard her as a winsome maiden. Sort of sounds like a Hallmark Channel movie, doesn't it? The roller coaster track will have twists and turns, ups and downs, a surprise ending, and it will all be over before we know it. So let's jump on board, that author says, and disengage the brakes. Act 2 of the book of Ruth opens with this woman, this newly widowed woman, Ruth, a young lady, determined to provide. I mean, if you could say anything about her, she is determined. She is determined to provide now for her and her mother-in-law through the hard work of gleaning, picking up what people leave behind to try to feed her and her mother-in-law. It is incredibly hard work, and many people, because of the character of this lady, took notice, and in particular, one man noticed the character of this young lady as she seeks to provide just a little bit of food for her and her mother-in-law. So now it is almost as if the tide is beginning to turn from that speed bump in chapter 1. These two destitute widows now have the opportunity perhaps to provide, as meager as it may be, for themselves. If I were going to call the first scene anything, I might call it Boy Sees Girl. See, it's sort of a romance novel in disguise, but it's really not about the love between a boy and a girl, but rather a God and His people. And that scene then opens with Naomi had a relative. These very important words. It's sort of an insertion by the author. It's not really part of the narrative, but it just sets the stage for the rest of the chapter. It's almost as if a narrator would read these words before we jump into the action. Now Naomi, that destitute older widow, had a relative on her husband's side. Now this is important. A man of standing. He is an Ish Gabor. That he is a guy's guy. He's a man's man. He's an outstanding man, a man of wealth, a man of honor, a man of dignity, a man that other people come to for wisdom and provision. In the days of the judges, this term was used of a warrior. He was a great man, an Ish Gabor, a man of wealth and influence, a noble man. Seems ironic that this man would then be from the clan of Elimelech, the guy who took his family and ran away from the place of God's blessing to a place he should have never gone, probably out of fear, not out of faith, thinking that he could provide for his family. He goes down there, and the three men die. Now, here is the irony of it all, in that the fact that this poor widow woman has come back home along with her daughter-in-law, Ruth. And we realize in the story that there was a relative on her husband's side. And he was from the clan of her husband. Now, a clan is the link between a family and the tribe in Israel. In Israel's history, your family meant everything. It gave order to life. It connected you to the lifeblood of the workings of Yahweh. God takes a man, Jacob, and he changes his name to Israel. And Jacob, or Israel, has 12 sons. Those 12 sons become the 12 tribes of Israel. Each one of those 12 sons then has additional sons and daughters. From those sons, then, different clans begin to form. In the little town of Bethlehem, there is a man who is of the clan of Elimelech, and his name, verse 1 goes on to say, is Boaz. And this is really cool, because if you remember the names of the sons of Elimelech, like sickly and weakling, wavering near death, pining, dying of, what did I say last week? The Zika virus. Boaz, on the other hand, means in his name is strength. It can mean life, livelihood, vitality. He is everything that Ruth's former husband and his brother were not. And God, somehow in his providence, provides for the story then to begin to unfold after the narrator would read those words. And now Ruth seems to know something, as we jump back into the narrative, of Israelite culture, in that God would reward benevolent acts done for those less fortunate in their culture. And indeed, he did. Verse 2, and Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up leftover grain. Let me glean. That's what glean means, to pick up. Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. In other words, the law in Israel said that for those that are destitute, for the poor, for the widow, for the orphan, for those that can't provide for themselves, for the most vulnerable in society, this is what I want landowners to do. When you send your workers into the field, whatever they drop, let them leave it there as far as the grain goes, so that the poor people can come behind them and pick it up. And this was a law in Israel. Leave the corners of your field for the poor people. Leave the grain behind so that they can pick up. It was God's welfare plan. But here's the really neat thing, because when we think welfare, sometimes we can have a negative image. Welfare is good for those who need it for a while, but it's bad for everyone else when people abuse that system. Here's the deal in Israel, though. They had to work for what they got. It wasn't a free ride. And it was the time of the judges, and Ruth knew that this would be dangerous. So rather than any other option, she approaches her mother-in-law and she says, Naomi, I know you used to be beautiful. I know you used to be delightful. I mean, that's what your name means. But now you're bitter. Let me see if I can't help turn this around and we can maybe get some food in our bellies. In the meantime, let me go out into the field. And let me see if I can't glean a little bit of food for us to eat. And so Naomi, she responds in kindness. She's probably too old to do it herself. And she knows that maybe with the strong back and the youth of Ruth, they do have a chance after all. So Naomi said to her, go ahead, my daughter. And so she went out. I mean, it's like she embraced this life fully. She'd already renounced her former lifestyle. Her identity now is all tied up in Naomi's identity and Naomi's people, Naomi's land and Naomi's God. And she just goes out and she enters a field and she began to glean behind the harvester. She's picking up these few grains that they're leaving behind. And here is a key phrase. And there's two of them in close proximity. As it turned out, I'll come back to that in a second. She was working in a field belonging to Boaz, this guy that we're set up to know in the very first verse of the second act. So she goes into the field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Now that's the second time we hear this, right? So this is Boaz from the clan of Elimelech. It's important. It's mentioned 2 times. The writer wants us to take note of this. It's now going from some commentary read by a narrator into the story. And it seems to be very important, and it seems to be hinting at something, because in Hebrew, as it turns out, means something like her chanced upon. In other words, by a human perspective, this was nothing more than chance. But when you begin to put the picture together, all of the individual pieces, what you see is this is beyond chance. And I think that's what the writer is intending. The NIV is weak on this. It doesn't really give us the full force. Her chanced upon. In other words, Naomi goes out on her first day of work. And she goes to some outlying area outside of Bethlehem where there are sections of fields. And by chance, she goes to one section of many sections of fields. And from that section, she chooses a particular property by chance. And on that property, there is a field which by chance she also chooses. And by chance, as her chance was, it turns out to be the field of a guy named Boaz, who is part of Naomi's family, who is a wealthy and respected individual and has within the power of his hand to actually redeem them. Naomi probably doesn't realize any of this first. She simply, by the providence of God, goes to this field. And it's presented as her chance that she just chanced upon. In other words, all of these coincidences can only be explained by the hand of God, putting her in the right place at just the right time. And here's that other phrase. Verse 4, just then. Like Naomi shows up after all these series of chance after chance after chance, and then just then, Boaz, the guy that we've been talking about, shows up. She doesn't know who he is, right? He just shows up, and you can imagine. She's working there. She's probably fearful. She doesn't know how she's going to be treated by the harvesters, because even though they're supposed to provide for her, this is the time of the judges. She's taking her life into her own hands, and then the boss shows up. She's probably going to stick out like a sore thumb, being a Moabitess. He shows up and he calls out to his workers, his harvesters. He greets them, "The Lord be with you." These are sincere words of a sincere man. "The Lord be with you." And then they answer him back, "And the Lord bless you." We don't know what kind of characters these are. We know that we can trust him, but we don't know if we can trust the harvesters that work for him. And so, I'm sure that Naomi, being a woman in a vulnerable situation, is like, oh great, I just wanted to go undercover. I just wanted to get a little bit of food. I'm going to be bold. I just stepped in line with all the other workers, and now the boss shows up. Everybody's attention is drawn away from that and to him, and I hope that nobody notices me, even though I may be sticking out like a sore thumb. I wonder if she just didn't keep working, like nothing was up, like she didn't hear. So you have to kind of read between the lines a little bit in this story and to get the full impact of what's going on and realize how vulnerable she is in this situation. She's working perhaps where it would be dangerous for her to work, in a time that would present even more danger. And then the boss shows up. Maybe she should be there. Maybe she shouldn't. She doesn't know. If he's not a man of character, then his men can have her way with her and leave her for dead as far as he's concerned. Maybe her heart was put at ease at the way that he greeted his harvesters. We don't know. We just know that another coincidence, another chance happening. Like all of a sudden, she's at the right place at the right time, and at such the right place and such the right time that the right guy shows up. It demonstrates the fact that not only was God in charge of getting them back to Bethlehem, the house of bread, at just the right time at the beginning of the barley harvest, but now he has led this destitute widow to just the right field to meet just the right guy. I mean, this is beyond comprehension. If you're just reading this the one time through, you don't pick it up. You don't realize the significance of it. But the author here, remember, this was orally passed down from generation to generation. This became a finely honed story, talking about God's providence, even when people aren't aware that he's working. And so these little phrases are used to demonstrate that God is working behind the scenes, even though the people in the story don't realize it. She's worried about staying alive and providing for her and her mother-in-law. And she ends up at the right place at the right time. And so Boaz is called out to his workers, and they call back. And then the most terrible thing in the whole world happens. Verse 5. Then Boaz asked the overseer of the harvesters, who does this young woman belong to? She doesn't know anything is going on. But the head of the harvesters, the overseer of the harvesters, he knows what's going on. He noticed that she shows up. And listen what he says. He said, she is the Moabite who came from Moab with Naomi. And this is not a put down. Good men, good families in Israel, even during the times of the judges, knew that it was God's law, that they should honor those aliens, those foreigners from outside the country, even during the time of gleaning, so that they could be provided for. Apparently, the overseer knew the character of Boaz, and he begins to talk then about this young lady, Ruth, that he has spied out and been watching himself in the field. He says she is a Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. But he doesn't stop there. Verse 7, she said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvester. She's not taking anything for granted. It's her right, but she's not messing around. She is a kind, polite, gracious person herself, and so she would not presume that in the day in which she lived, that kindness would be shown to her in return. She's not looking for any kind of kindness necessarily, but it doesn't change the kind of person that she is. She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. In other words, she's a Moabite woman. She came back with Naomi. She showed up. Apparently she was somewhat familiar with our law. And she was so gracious, even though she didn't have to. She went ahead and asked. And then I watched her work all morning. And this young lady is impressive. That's how the overseer replies. Apparently through this whole interaction, Boaz's interest is piqued somewhat. Scene 2 of Act 2, boy meets girl. So boy sees girl, now boy meets girl. Apparently, he goes to the harvesters in the meantime, as we'll find out, and he says, hey, hands off on that Moabite woman over there. He gives strict orders to his men, and then he approaches Ruth, and the conversation that ensues is very, very intriguing. His words are cordial, just like with his workers. They are respectful, and they are words of divine protection. Verse 8, scene 2, boy meets girl. So Boaz said to Ruth, so now Boaz is approaching this young lady. My daughter, a term of affection, recognizing an age difference. My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Look, I know you're a Moabite woman. I've already inquired who you belong to. In other words, whose family are you part of? And are you connected in any way to another man? He approaches her. He says, my daughter, we've been taking notice of you. Listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field and don't go away. Stay here with the women and work for me. Watch the fields where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled. This is grace upon grace on the part of Boaz. Not only is she a foreigner, gleaning in the field, getting just a little bit, but working hard, only taking one break all morning, While she's doing backbreaking work, she's garnered the notice of the overseer and probably everybody else that was around because she was a foreigner. And now here is the owner of the field, this very obviously important man. He comes up to her and he gives her instructions. He says, stay in my field, work with my women. I know you'll be safe because I told the guys, and they'll listen, or else, not to lay a finger on you. And here's what I want you to do. If you get thirsty, I'm going to give you the privilege of doing something that no other worker has the privilege of doing, and that is take a drink from the jars that the men have poured. Obviously for the harvesters, who are of a higher rank than the workers who move behind them. In other words, I'm elevating your position. I'm showing you special favor. I've taken notice of your character and your hard work. And so I want to reward you, and I want to protect you, and I want to provide for you all that I can. She is so overwhelmed by all of this, verse 10, at this she bowed down her face all the way to the ground. And this seems drastic to us, but this was common in the Middle East. It's a sign of humility, and it's a sign that there's a recognition of great grace that's been extended. So she bows all the way down to the ground, and she asks him, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner? Remember, she doesn't have a clue that he knows anything about her. And the truth is that maybe he's treating her this way on a lot of different levels, because a man of character doesn't treat people like objects to be used. He treats people like subjects to provide for them and to support them and to help them in every way. This is a depiction of the character of a man who looks upon a field, sees a woman that he doesn't know. Obviously, there's an age disparagement, and he doesn't know if she's connected to another family, for sure. As a matter of fact, he wants to clear the air and find out, and so he asked, who does she belong to? She's the Moabite woman that came back with Naomi. Aha. But she's too young for me. So I just want to be kind to her. I've heard good news about this girl. I mean, she is of impeccable character. So now, let me just bless. I'm not going to use her. That's not my character. My character is to, when I see another person of character, even if I don't see a person of character, I treat them as a person with respect. And that's what I want to do for her. She's not an object to be used up, but rather she's a person that I have the opportunity to bless. Naomi recognizes this, and she wants to know, why have you shown me such favor in your sight? Boaz replied, verse 11, I've been told about what you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. I mean, this is a small town. Word has gotten around. I mean, remember when they came back into town, the whole town was buzzing. Is this Naomi? I mean, she looks old and haggard now. She left so lively and so joyful. Now she's come back and she's just beaten down. You're that girl that I've already heard about. In other words, your character has preceded our meeting. Isn't that the truth? When people of good character live their life in the same way, no matter what the circumstances, ultimately you end up hearing about them. And perchance this man gets the opportunity then to meet her and to honor her and to grace her with provision. His plans aren't done yet, and his words aren't done about what he's heard about her. He says, I heard about what you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and you came to live with a people that you did not know before. You renounced everything. You gave it all up. You demonstrated that you, even though you're a Moabite woman, are a person of hesed, of faithfulness, of loyalty, of love, of grace. I've heard all about you. I think, if tradition is correct, that Ruth was probably a very attractive lady. But what was more important to Boaz was that she was a woman of character, and he'd heard about this character. And so his next words are a benediction, just like his first words were to his harvesters and his workers, with a word of grace. So we hear another word of grace here, a benediction, a word of protection, a prayer protection. May the Lord repay you for what you've done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. In other words, what he's saying is, look, I know that the Lord balances justice and mercy out, either in this life or the next. But here's my prayer for you, that you experience it in this life. Because what you've done is, you have, like a baby chick, vulnerable and alone, found yourself running to the mother hen, your mama, as she spreads her wings to protect you. That's how the Lord, it's my desire for the Lord to treat you in that way, just the way a mother hen would treat her own chick, providing protection. Neither one of them knew that Boaz was going to play a part in this protection at this point in the story. He simply utters a benediction that would be common to Israelite, giving us a picture of the great protection that God offers to those that honor Him with their life. They can run to Him and they can know that they have protection. And so he pronounces that benediction. You've come under the wings of the Almighty. May He now provide and protect for you. And so look how she responds, verse 13. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord, she said. You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have a standing as one of your servants. So Ruth responds with deep vulnerability. She shows, if you will, her emotion of what this really means to her. When it says that you put me at ease, the Hebrew reads something like, you've allowed me to breathe easy again. And when the Hebrew is translated into, you've spoken kindly to your servant, it means in Hebrew literally, you've spoken to my heart. Like, you have given me complete comfort. I can breathe easy because now my heart knows that I can trust in the God of Israel, and I can trust in the person that I'm working for, even though I don't have the standing even of one of His servants. There's two words in Hebrew for servant. One of them would be a worker in the field. The other would be one who would be a step beneath a worker in the field. That is what Naomi's saying. Listen, I don't even qualify to work for you, and yet you've shown me grace. I can never repay you. I can only be thankful. I can acknowledge that this God that you have now pronounced a blessing on me from and for. Hey, all I can do is do what's best in your sight now. I don't deserve any of this. And it flies in the face of people who think that they deserve everything. She'd been working hard. She'd been good to her mother-in-law. She embraced a whole new life. Hey, I deserve a little bit of recognition. That's not Ruth. She doesn't presume on anything because that's not her character. You see, people of character are the same always. And we're going to find out that not only is Ruth the same always, but Boaz is as well. The story doesn't stop there. So, boy sees girl, boy meets girl. Now, boy says, I want to feed the girl. Boy feeds girl. Scene 3. Boaz, in this scene, shows his increasing interest, not just in a romantic relationship, but in the possibility that he can provide for somebody who can't provide for herself. She had probably come that day with no food, not knowing where she would be when she left home. She didn't need any extra baggage. She just simply went out to work, and she was willing to work all day and wait till the evening to eat. She could have perhaps eaten some of the grains during the day, but then maybe she wouldn't have as much to take home to Naomi. So instead, she probably chose to go without food. Naomi would have expected this of Ruth in one sense, but in another sense, she would have also expected that Ruth would have eaten some food for herself to give her strength for the day. Either way, Ruth chooses not to have any food that day. Boaz knows this as well. And so this is what he does. This is lunchtime. He says, at mealtime, Boaz said to her, now he's talking to her. And he says this, come over here. Slide a little closer. I want to get a good look at you. I want to have a conversation with you. Have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar. I mean, this is surprise upon surprise. I mean, this outstanding individual, this wealthy man, eats with his harvesters and his workers for one, but now he's invited this Moabitess to come and eat with his harvesters. Not only with his harvesters, but with he himself. He says, come here. He gives her a personal invitation to eat at his table. Dip some of this hard bread into this wine vinegar to make it a little bit more soft, a little bit more palpable. When she sat down with the harvesters, and they probably thought that they were too good for her to sit with them. Do you think that that goes without knowing on the part of Boaz? Absolutely not. So she will take some of the bread, and she goes to sit down with the harvesters, right? They probably don't want her. They're probably a little bit envious because the boss is showing her special favor. Who is she? They may be thinking. But then he goes a step further and he offers her some roasted grain. Now he's saying, look, you can sit down anywhere that you want. As a matter of fact, here, take some bread, take some of this wine vinegar to soften the bread, and take some grain too. Mix it all up. I know it's not that tasty, but this will help a little bit. And by the way, why don't you sit with me, not just with the harvesters? Now, of course, Ruth is probably blown away, but she's probably hungry too. So look what it said. She ate all she wanted, and she had some left over. How ironic. What a choice of words. She went to the field to pick up leftovers, and now she's got leftovers herself after she eats her fill. She takes home a doggy bag. We'll find out. Completely unexpected. That's how far Boaz's grace extended. Maybe he noticed that during the meal she had eaten as much as she could, and maybe she has a napkin and she wraps it up and she sticks it somewhere, on her garment, underneath her sash or something. Says, I'm going to take some home to my mother-in-law. Another sign of character. She didn't have to do that. She ate her fill. And then she had some left over and she decides that she wants to take it home. And Boaz says, hey, that's good by me. Verse 15. Now, Ruth, again, she takes nothing for granted. She gets up to glean, and Boaz gave orders to her men, let her gather among the sheaves, and do not reprimand her. In other words, she doesn't just have to go behind the workers, the harvesters, but now let her move a little closer where she can get even more grain. Verse 16, even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and do not rebuke her. In other words, I'm showing her special favor here, okay? Let her get a little closer so she can pick up a little bit more. As a matter of fact, as the workers bundle up all of those sheaves, pull some out so that it'll make her work a little bit easier and she'll get a little bit more than what she had ever anticipated. God is working behind the scenes in all of this. Boaz and Ruth, they don't know completely what is going on. They're simply responding to one another's character. And now this intriguing relationship begins to develop. And Boaz says, look, I protected you from my workers. Now I'm going to provide for you all more than you can ever imagine. Not just because of who you are, but because of who I am. Isn't that a picture of God? God provides for us regardless of what kind of character we have. But He will go the extra mile if we demonstrate faithfulness to Him to provide. And that's what Boaz is doing for for Ruth. Actually, for Naomi too. For Ruth. So, verse 17. So Ruth gleaned in the field till evening. Like she could have stopped with what she had, but she stayed hard at work. This girl took nothing for granted. She wasn't messing around. She came there to get food because she didn't know what tomorrow held, even though she knew she could be back in the field. Who knows if Boaz would show up again and she would indeed be protected. So she worked all the way until evening, and then at the end of the day, after this backbreaking work, look what she did. She threshed the barley that she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. To thresh means she beat it with a stick to separate, or a club. She probably just had a stick. A club you could do more at a time, but she probably just had a stick. She beat it to separate the barley grains which is the edible part, from the chaff, which is the unedible part. So she works all day. She has this crazy encounter. Now she's got more barley than she knows what to do with, so she beats it to death to separate it, and then she puts it in a bag, an ephah, about a measurement. It's like 6 gallons or so, 6 U.S. gallons, 30 to 50 pounds, they say. Okay? None of that means all that much to us necessarily unless you've been a farmer. But then look what she does. She's done all this. This is an amazing woman. Verse 18. And she carried it back to town. We don't know how far she walked. She works all day. She beats her food to death. She puts it in a bag, and she carries 30 to 50 pounds all the way back to town. And her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. So her brain starts working, because Naomi's brain, in the story you'll find out, Naomi's brain never stops working. And most of the time, neither does her mouth. I mean, this is a real-to-life story. Women think about 10 times faster than men. And I think we can all recognize that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. God made us different. So the guys sit by and listen, and the women do all the talking. In this case, Ruth was a woman of action, and she had no choice because she was with a senior woman, and she just had to listen to her mother-in-law. So she brings all this barley home, and like her mother-in-law Naomi takes notice. What in the world is going on here? Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over from what she had eaten. And so Naomi is like beside herself now, and the only way that I can equate it to something of modern times would be to like the theme song to the Jeffersons probably comes to mind. Now we're up in the big leagues, and we're taking our turn at bat. I mean, we got this thing down now. Something big is happening. We've gone from poverty to wealth. And her mind, the gears begin to turn. This is too good to be true. I can't believe it. Where did all of this come from? Right? And she is expecting a report from her daughter-in-law. But before Ruth can even get anything out of her mouth, her excitement bubbles over. She can't keep her mouth shut. And all of a sudden, things start flying out of her mouth. Her mother-in-law asks her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." And I believe that she said this all in one breath. And then maybe she took a breath. She gave Ruth a chance to answer. Then Ruth said to her mother-in-law about the one at whose field she had been working. And she doesn't know necessarily. Naomi doesn't know whose field that Ruth was in. So Ruth begins to tell her about the one whose field she worked in, and we don't know the details. We don't know if she said, "Oh, he was a great guy and he invited me to come to eat. As a matter of fact, that's where the food that I brought home for you to eat. I had some of it for lunch. That was the doggy bag left over." I mean, this guy was awesome. All of his workers were good to me. His harvesters were even good to me. I can't believe it. We don't know if she said all of that. And I think that Naomi probably didn't care because her mind is racing. And I mean, I've studied this. I think this is a reality here. The name of the man, she says. So Ruth is going on about the man, but she doesn't say his name. The name of the man I work for today was Boaz. And now Naomi's excitement is through the roof because he is a near kinsman. Now it's more than about eating for a few weeks. Because believe it or not, mostly all you could get in one day's work would be enough to eat for the next day for 2 widows. Here Ruth has brought home enough for weeks and weeks and weeks. And it becomes more than just providing for the next few weeks. Now the gears are really turning. I mean, Naomi, who was destitute, now has food. But then she's learned that this guy is part of the family. And she knows the law that God has laid out for his people in providing for widows. It's called the law of the Levirate marriage. It has nothing to do with the Levitical code or anything like that. As a matter of fact, the Levitical code talks about different things in relation to this. This term actually means brother-in-law. And it hints at what she's looking at. By the time of the Judges, this brother-in-law idea, this brother-in-law marriage is extended to other people within the family besides just the brother-in-law. So Naomi says, hey, we get to eat for several weeks. Then Ruth says the name of the guy she worked for, it's Boaz. Naomi's eyes, bong, bong, bong. I can't believe this. This is great. Not only can we eat for a long time, but I'm beginning to make plans now for the future. And it involves you and this guy. You don't know it yet, Ruth. And Naomi's not divulging anything she doesn't need to at the moment, right? But I know that her mind is racing. She says, I've been working for Boaz, verse 20. Naomi comes back, the Lord bless him. Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, he has not showing kindness to the living and to the dead. I mean, it appears from this phrase, the sentence that she's known of Boaz for a long time, and he's the same as he used to be. He always shows kindness for the living. That's us, you and me. Naomi, Ruth, two widow ladies. He never has stopped showing kindness to the living and here's the key, and to the dead. This is the reference to the husbands that they lost. In particular, Ruth's husband, Mahlon. He has never stopped showing kindness. The gears are turning. In Naomi's mind, Ruth doesn't know what's going on yet. This is a good guy. He's all the time showing kindness to the living and to the dead. And then she throws this out. Oh, by the way, this man is a close relative. He qualifies to be our Redeemer. He is one of our guardian redeemers, one of our kinsman redeemers. One of the ones who might qualify to actually purchase us, to redeem our lives, to give us a life in Him. And this is ultimately important in the Jewish culture because they recognized that their identity was all tied up in the family name. It was up, according to the law, it was up to the brother-in-law or a close relative to marry a widowed girl, to give her children so that the family line could continue. It was ultimately important that that's where their identity was wrapped up in. And Naomi is utterly excited. She's already said, Ruth, go home. Orpah, go home. I can't have kids. If I did, would you wait around for them? Come on, get real. Go home, get some husbands so that your family can continue on. Orpah goes home. Ruth stays with her. Now God has providentially provided in everyday occurrence way for this family, in a way that goes beyond just providing food. Now he has provided security for the family and the family name, and it is utterly, utterly important to Naomi, and she recognized this guy can turn everything around for us and continue the line. Remember when she came home, Naomi said, look, I went out full. I had my family, but I came back empty. They were all gone. All I have is Ruth with me. All of a sudden, Naomi's hope grows just a little more. And so she's going on. And Ruth the Moabitess said, in verse 21, he said to me, stay with my workers until they finish harvesting the grain. It's almost like Ruth was trying to tell the story. Naomi interrupts with all of these crazy ideas going on in her head. When Naomi does finally take a breath, Ruth jumps back in and says, hey, he told me to stay here, to come back. Gears are still turning. They're even going faster now in Naomi's mind. And she's thinking, hey, this is a pretty good idea. Not only can she be safe, but now she can stay close to Boaz. And I'm really hoping that something will happen there. She doesn't give that part away quite yet, though. So Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it will be good for you, my daughter. Yes, it will. It'll also be good for me. It'll be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women and work. Notice she never stops giving advice. Naomi said that Boaz told her that she should stay with his workers. Those workers might be men. Naomi catches it. She picks up on that. And just like a good mother-in-law, she says, oh, no, make sure, Ruth, that you stay with the women. She can't stop giving advice. Ruth knows where she needs to stay, but Naomi has to say it. Stay with the women. Stay with the women of Boaz and glean until the barley and the wheat harvest were finished. That's how long she stayed. Not just for the barley harvest, but also for the wheat harvest. 7 weeks she stayed. 50 days in all. This is huge in Judaism. This encompasses 2 harvest festivals. The barley harvest, the harvest of the first fruits, as well as the wheat harvest. These correspond with the Feast of First Fruits and the Feast of Weeks that we see in the New Testament that the church calls the Feast of Pentecost. Jews today read the story of Ruth in remembrance of this harvest festival in which God took a faithful convert and provided for her, and through her line gave her the most famous king in all of Israel, the thing that the people were looking for, King David. And they say, hey, this is the deal. They tried to kill us. This is what they say at every feast. God saved us. Let's eat. That's the story of Ruth. And they read it to this day during that feast of Pentecost, when the wheat is harvested, because this was the same time of year that Ruth took place. We see a convert dedicated now to the law of God, part of God's people. They welcome her openly, and on the day of Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit came, what happened? 5,000 people were accepted into the household of God on that day. It all fits together in God's providential plan, and Ruth is the kernel, if you will, of all of that story. And Jews today read this story even though they don't recognize the day of Pentecost and the coming of the Holy Spirit and Gentile converts into Judaism. It doesn't matter. The story of Ruth tells the story of somebody who was on the outside. But because of God's providence and His grace, she was invited in. They don't know all of this is going on, but God is forever caring for His people. Naomi knows more than anybody in the story at this point. In Act 1, she's dismal. But in Act 2, she is delighted. There was a divine cloud of hope on her horizon now, about the size of a man's fist. It's far away, barely visible. But rain is coming. God was working, and she knew it, on her behalf. She recognized Boaz's actions before he even recognized what was going on. For the first time in perhaps more than a decade, Naomi had a glimmer of hope for her future. And it was all anchored in the hesed of Yahweh, in the covenant faithfulness of the loyal love of Yahweh directed towards His people. He will provide for His people. And so, in Naomi's mind and in Ruth's mind, listen, I love this. I lifted this from somebody else. So while Ruth was thinking barley, Naomi was thinking bride. While Ruth was thinking bread, Naomi was thinking wedding cake. While Ruth was thinking grain, Naomi was thinking grandma. For now, though, they still had food, and they had each other. Why? Because even in the mundane, God cares. He knows where you are, and He cares. And behind the scenes, He's working everything out for you. Stand with me if you would. And I know that there are people in this room today, and they're wondering, does God really know where I am? I have no explanation as to why I'm in this situation. All I know is that God has promised to provide for me. God will be faithful, and I don't have the answers, but God does. And He's working behind the scenes in your life to make that happen. So here's how I want to end today. Anybody who feels like that you're facing situations and you don't have the answers, and you're even wondering if God knows where you're at or if He cares. Remember, I said at the beginning, this is a story for people who doubt whether or not God cares and whether or not God will work everything out. If you're wondering about some things in your life right now, and you just need God to come through for you, maybe like never before, in faith, here's what I'm going to ask you to do. Just step out and come to the front so that we can pray for you. If your situation is beyond control as far as you're concerned, you've tried everything, even to the point where you're wondering if God cares. The story tells us that God cares. He'll provide for you in every way. If that's you, come on out. Come forward today. Just let us pray for you. God cares. If that's you. I think He's waiting for you to run to His open arms. For His care and His provision and His protection. It could be physical. It could be a situation at your workplace. It could be concerns about the future and how everything's going to work out. And all God is asking you to do is to be faithful, to allow Him to bless you. If Ruth hadn't gone to the field that day, nothing would have happened on her behalf. God couldn't have worked. And that's all God is asking us to do today. If there's something that you don't have the answer to and you're just fighting and struggling with it, we want to pray for you and remind you that God cares. So we have 3 people, and that's fine with me. That's exactly what God wants. Just people to say to Him, God, I don't know how all this is going to work out, but I trust you in it all. So on behalf of these 3 people, and anyone else 4 people, anyone else who may be struggling, I want to pray that they realize how much God cares. And then I'm going to pray, and I want you to join with me in that prayer, that God will begin to provide, and that it won't matter whether they see His provision or not, but that they'll have the peace of mind. They'll be able to take a deep breath because God has spoken to their heart that everything is going to be all right, that He's working behind the scenes. Let me go ahead and pray. Join with me. Lord, again, we have come to this place in our service where You've given us an opportunity to speak to our hearts, to put our fears at ease. And so, Lord, for those that have come forward today and those who have been hesitant, I simply pray, Lord, that as an act of faith and good faith in coming forward, that You would bless them graciously and that You would provide for them with health and finances and strength and direction and encouragement. Whatever it is that they need, God, I pray that You would provide for them in a way that would be most comforting to them. And in a way, God, that would help them to see beyond the natural, beyond the everyday, into Your heart, and to know that You care so deeply for them, that all of this has a purpose, that all of it will work out in the end, that You are indeed in the process of working great character in them. And it's painful, but in the end, it has purpose, and its purpose is found in You, and that You will indeed provide for them. Give them that assurance today before they leave this place, destitute, poor of spirit, hurting inside, hurting outside, hurting in their mind, hurting in their heart. God, I pray that You would provide for them comfort and provide for them protection along the way, so that as they run to Your open arms, they can find that protection and provision. Now, Lord, I pray this in Jesus' name, and I trust that as our Redeemer, you will indeed come through. We may not see it on this side, but Lord, today I'm praying that we will. There's provision and protection for each person in this room. Lord, I pray that you would extend it graciously, and may we respond in gracious ways as well to all of that. In Jesus' name, amen.